July 10, 1944. The engine of M4 Sherman Double Trouble is idling at 2,400 RPM. Inside the hull, the air is stagnant. It smells of cordite, unwashed bodies, and hot oil. The internal thermometer reads 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Driver Private First Class. John Miller grips the dual steering levers. His gloves are soaked in sweat. Through the periscope, he sees only green. It looks like a simple shrubbery. It is not. It is a Norman hedgerow. A 4-foot wall of compacted clay and stone, reinforced by 3 centuries of hawthorn roots. It is stronger than concrete. Miller signals the commander. He shifts the transmission into first gear. The 33-ton tank lurches forward. Ground speed, 12 miles per hour. The tracks churn the mud. The tank hits the bank. It does not penetrate. It climbs. The nose of the Sherman rises 30 degrees, then 40 degrees. The suspension groans under the shift in gravity. The tank is now a stationary object, tilted toward the sky. The main gun is pointing uselessly at the clouds. The hull machine gun is firing into the blue, but the bottom of the tank is exposed. The belly armor of an M4 Sherman is 25.4 millimeters thick, exactly 1 inch of mild steel. It was designed in 1941 to protect the crew from anti-personnel mines and shrapnel. It was never designed to face a high-velocity projectile. 400 yards away, concealed in the opposite tree line, a gunner from the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division is watching. He is looking through the sights of a PaK 40 7-meter anti-tank gun. He sees the gray underbelly of the American tank. He does not need to calculate windage. He does not need to lead the target. The target is offering itself to him. The German gunner squeezes the trigger. The firing pin strikes the primer. The shell leaves the barrel at 790 meters per second. Flight time is less than 0.6 seconds. The round impacts the Sherman's floor plate between the driver's seat and the transmission housing. There is no deflection. The shell penetrates the cabin. The physics of the interior change instantly. The pressure wave liquefies soft tissue. The white-hot shrapnel ignites the ammunition storage in the sponsons. The 75-millimeter shells cook off. Double Trouble does not explode immediately. It burns. The fire consumes the oxygen in the fighting compartment in 4 seconds. The crew of 5 men is incinerated before they can unlatch the hatches. The tank slides back down the hedgerow, a burning coffin of steel. This was the specific mechanical reality of the Battle of the Hedgerows. This was not a war of maneuver. It was a slaughter. On July 10th alone, the U.S. First Army lost 30 tanks to this exact sequence of events. The invasion of Europe had stopped cold. The generals called it a stalemate. The soldiers called it a meat grinder. The Allied invasion force, the most mechanized army in the history of human warfare, was being defeated by medieval gardening. The geography of the bocage country had not changed since the Roman Empire. The fields were small, 200 by 400 yards. Each field was a box, surrounded on all 4 sides by these impenetrable earthen walls. To take a field, you had to enter it. To enter it, you had to expose your belly. The Germans didn't have to win. They just had to wait. General Omar Bradley sat in his command tent, staring at a map that hadn't changed in 7 days. The lines were static. The casualty reports were not. The U.S. 29th Infantry Division was suffering 60% casualties in rifle platoons. They were fighting for yards. The logic of the offensive relies on momentum. Speed is armor. But in the bocage, speed was 0. The tanks were forced into single-file columns on narrow, sunken roads, where they were ambushed by Panzerfaust teams, or they were forced to climb the hedges, where they were sniped by anti-tank guns. The technical deficit was glaring. The standard M4 Sherman was 19 feet long and 9 feet wide. It utilized a vertical volute spring suspension, VVSS. This suspension was excellent for high-speed travel on flat ground. It was robust, easy to repair, and reliable. In the Hedgerows, it was a liability. It lacked the independent track articulation to crawl over the banks without pitching the hull upward. The German Panther and Tiger tanks, with their torsion bar suspension and overlapping road wheels, offered a more stable platform, but even they struggled in this terrain. But the Germans were on defense. They didn't need to move. They dug their tanks into the earth, leaving only the turret visible. A hull-down Panther tank presents a target profile of less than 3 feet. Its frontal armor is 100 mm thick and sloped. An American 75 mm shell bounces off it like a pebble. To kill a Panther, a Sherman has to flank it. In the bocage, there are no flanks. There are only the hedges. The geometry of the battlefield neutralized the American numerical advantage. 2,000 tanks were useless if they could only engage one at a time. Desperation breeds strange ideas. The first solution proposed by First Army Engineering was dynamite. The logic was sound. If you can't climb the wall, blow a hole in it. The protocol was established. 2 engineers would crawl forward under suppressive fire. They would carry 50 pounds of TNT in satchel charges. They would dig a hole in the base of the hedgerow, insert the charges, set a fuse, and retreat. The explosion would clear a gap wide enough for 1 tank. The execution was a disaster. It took 20 minutes to prepare a single breach. In those 20 minutes, the German mortar teams would triangulate the position. The whir of the Nebelwerfer rockets became the soundtrack of the failure. Engineer squads attempting manual breaches suffered a 38% casualty rate. And when the gap was finally blown, the explosion alerted every German gunner in the sector. They simply aimed their guns at the smoke. The first tank through the gap died instantly. The breach became a choke point. The second solution was the dozer tank. The M1 dozer blade was a hydraulically operated shovel attached to the front of a Sherman. It was heavy, 4,500 pounds. It shifted the tank's center of gravity forward, putting immense strain on the front bogie wheels. It blocked the bow machine gun, reducing the tank's firepower. But it worked. A dozer tank could push through a hedge in 3 minutes without exposing its belly. The problem was logistics. There were not enough blades. The D-Day invasion planners had anticipated fighting on the open plains of France. They had not prioritized siege equipment. In the entire 2nd Armored Division, there were only 6 M1 dozer blades available. 6 blades for 14,000 men. Commanders began hoarding them. They became more valuable than the tanks themselves. But 6 blades cannot clear a path for an army of 1,000,000 men. The invasion was backed up all the way to the beach. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and ambulances were gridlocked. July 12, 1944. The atmosphere in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron was toxic. They were bivouacked in a muddy field near St. Lo. They had been patrolling the same 3 miles of front for a week. They were tired of burying their friends. Sergeant Curtis G. Culin, a 29-year-old from Cranford, New Jersey, was sitting on a crate, cleaning his fingernails with a bayonet. Culin was not a career soldier. In civilian life, he was a salesman for a typewriter company. He understood mechanics, but he was not an engineer. The conversation that night was the same as every night: how to beat the hedges. A soldier from Tennessee, a private named Roberts, was complaining about the vegetation. "The hedges are so thick," Roberts said. "You need teeth to get through 'em." He gestured with his hands. "Like a hay fork. Pin the damn thing down so the tracks can bite." The other men laughed. They made jokes about turning the 2nd Armored into a farming co-op. They joked about attaching lawn mowers to the Shermans. Culin didn't laugh. He stopped cleaning his nails. He looked at the front of a nearby M3 Stuart light tank. He visualized the physics. The problem with the Sherman wasn't lack of power. The Ford GAA V8 engine produced 500 horsepower. The problem was the vector of force. When the tank hit the hedge, the resistance was at the top of the tracks, causing the tank to pivot upward. If they could anchor the tank to the base of the hedge, the horsepower would drive the tank through the dirt, not over it. Culin stood up. He walked over to the maintenance tent. He found Captain John J. King, the squadron maintenance officer. It was late. King was exhausted. Culin explained the idea. "We weld prongs to the final drive assembly," Culin said. "Steel teeth. We hit the hedge low. The teeth bite in. The tank stays flat." Captain King looked at the sergeant. He knew the regulations. Modifying the hull of a tank was a court-martial offense. Welding onto the final drive housing could warp the steel and destroy the transmission. King said. They didn't have blueprints. They didn't have steel. They had a scrap pile. The specific material they needed had to be strong enough to withstand a 30-ton impact, but rigid enough not to bend. They couldn't use mild steel. They needed hardened structural iron. Culin remembered the beaches. He remembered the Czech hedgehogs. The Germans had planted thousands of them on Omaha and Utah beaches to rip the bottoms out of the landing craft. These obstacles were made of 6-inch steel channel iron, specifically L-profile beams. They were high-tensile German steel, manufactured in the Ruhr Valley. Culin grabbed a jeep and a team of welders. They drove back to the beach. It was a graveyard of metal. They used oxyacetylene torches to cut the legs off the German obstacles. They loaded the jagged beams into the truck. The irony was palpable. The steel Hitler had placed to stop the invasion was about to be used to save it. Back at the depot, the fabrication began. It was ugly work. The welders, working under tarps to hide the light from German night patrols, cut the beams into 24-inch lengths. They sharpened the ends into points. They didn't look like precise engineering tools. They looked like tusks. They brought in a light tank for the prototype. The placement was critical. Culin directed the welders to attach the tusks to the towing lugs on the final drive housing. This was the point of failure for the skeptics. The ordnance officers who heard about the project were furious. They argued that the final drive bolts were designed to hold the tension of a towing cable, not the impact of a collision with a wall. They predicted the bolts would shear. They predicted the drive housing would crack, leaking transmission fluid and seizing the gears. Culin ignored them. He trusted the strength of the casting. He trusted the weld. By dawn on July 14th, the prototype was ready. It looked ridiculous. A small light tank with 4 jagged steel teeth protruding from its nose. They called it the Rhino. The name stuck, but a cool name doesn't clear a hedgerow. They needed a test. They needed a witness. General Omar Bradley, the commander of the First Army, was touring the sector. Captain King managed to get him to the testing field. Bradley was a pragmatist. He didn't care about regulations. He cared about the breakout. The test field contained a standard hedgerow, 5 feet high, 6 feet thick at the base. Tangled briars. Culin climbed into the turret. He tapped the driver. "Hit it," he said. "Don't slow down." The driver revved the twin Cadillac engines. The tank accelerated. 10 miles per hour. 15 miles per hour. The officers flinched. They expected the tank to rear up. They expected the sound of snapping bolts. The Rhino hit the bank. The sound was deep and terrestrial. The teeth slashed into the base of the hedge. The tank did not rise. The prongs acted as a fulcrum, pinning the nose to the earth. The tank's momentum pushed the earth forward. The roots snapped with the sound of rifle shots. The entire section of the hedgerow, dirt, stones, and bush, was lifted up and pushed ahead of the tank like a bulldozer blade. The tank burst through the other side in 8 seconds. The belly remained covered. The gun remained level. The tank spun around, shaking off a cloud of dust. The crew was alive. The transmission was intact. General Bradley walked over to the breach. He examined the cut. It was clean. He looked at the teeth on the tank. They were scratched, but straight. He turned to his aide, Colonel Wilson. The order was short. "I want this on every tank in the First Army. Now." The mockery ended instantly. The farming equipment was now classified top secret. But the logistics of the order were terrifying. Bradley wanted 500 tanks modified in 1 week. Operation Cobra, the Great Breakout Offensive, was scheduled for July 25th. They had 11 days. There was no factory to call. There was no supply chain. They had to build a manufacturing industry in the middle of a war zone, using scavenged trash. This is the part of the war history books skip. They talk about the strategy. They ignore the welding fumes. If you want to see the specific weld patterns and the blueprints Culin sketched in the mud, hit that like button. It helps us preserve the mechanical history of the war. Subscribe if you haven't. Now, back to the fabrication yard. The 1st Army Ordnance Department was mobilized. Every arc welder, every torch, and every mechanic was pulled off the line. They formed Rhino teams. These teams fanned out to the beaches. They dismantled the anti-invasion obstacles on an industrial scale. The specifications were standardized: 4 tusks for a light tank, 5 for a Sherman. The tusks were to be mounted 30 inches apart. The welds had to be multi-pass, high heat penetration. The visual transformation of the U.S. armored force was frightening. The clean, rounded lines of the Sherman tank were gone. They now looked like prehistoric beasts. The soldiers painted eyes on the front of the transmission housings. They named their tanks Jaws, the Cutter, and Culin's Beast. The psychological shift was palpable. The tank crews, who days before felt like sitting ducks, now felt like hunters. They had a weapon the enemy didn't know existed. Security was paramount. If the Germans found out about the Rhino, they would change their tactics. They would mine the hedgerows. They would dig anti-tank ditches behind the walls. So, the modified tanks were hidden. They were parked in orchards, covered with camouflage nets and hay. The crews were forbidden from discussing the device over the radio. The Germans, looking through their binoculars from the ridges of St. Lo, saw only the same green fields. They assumed the Americans were still trapped. While the welders worked, the tacticians rewrote the book. General Collins, commanding the 7 Corps, developed a new doctrine: the Roosevelt method. It was simple. The tanks would not use the roads. They would move cross-country, cutting through the hedges. The infantry would follow behind the tanks, protected by the armor. The tanks would spray the corners of the next field with machine gun fire before breaking through. It was a rolling wall of steel and fire, but the clock was ticking. The weather in Normandy in July 1944 was atrocious. Rain turned the fields into swamps. The mud threatened to bog down the tanks, even with the Rhino devices. The start date of Operation Cobra was delayed. The tension in the assembly areas was electric. 1,500 heavy bombers were waiting in England. 2,000 tanks were idling in France. Culin, the sergeant who started it all, was back with his unit, waiting for the order. The Germans were confident. Field Marshal Gunther von Klug reported to Berlin that the American advance had been contained. He requested more reserves, but he believed the Hedgerows were an unbreakable defensive line. He moved his Panzer Lehr Division, an elite armored unit, close to the front line near St. Lo to prepare for a counterattack. He positioned them perfectly to stop a road-bound assault. He did not know that the roads were about to become irrelevant. July 25, 1944. The sky cleared. The drone of engines filled the air. Not tank engines, aircraft engines. 1,500 B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators appeared over the horizon. This was the carpet bombing. For 60 minutes, the earth shook. They dropped 4,000 tons of high explosives on a rectangular box of terrain 6,000 yards long and 1,500 yards wide. The Panzer Lehr Division was in the center of that box. The bombing stopped. The silence lasted for 10 seconds. Then, the ground war began. Sergeant William S. Jones, commanding a Rhino-equipped M4A1, received the signal. "Move out." He kicked the driver's shoulder. The tank surged forward. Jones approached the first hedgerow. It was tall, dense, and forbidding. A week ago, this would have been a death sentence. Today, Jones didn't hesitate. The Rhino hit the wall. The sensation inside the tank was violent but controlled. The steel teeth sliced the roots. The tank shoved a 3-ton section of earth into the field beyond. Jones looked through his periscope. He expected to see a German anti-tank gun. Instead, he saw chaos. The Germans were still reeling from the bombardment. But more importantly, they were looking the wrong way. They were watching the gate, 100 yards to the left.
"Gunner, traverse right.
They were not
Coax,
watching the wall.
fire!"
Jones screamed. The turret spun. The coaxial 30 caliber machine gun erupted. The German infantry squad was cut down before they could lift their MP-40s. The tank didn't stop. It rolled over the foxholes. It crossed the field in 40 seconds. It hit the next hedge. Crunch. Another breach. Another field. The tank was not road-bound. It was swimming through the landscape. Multiply this by 300. All across the front, Sherman tanks were bursting through walls that were supposed to be solid. The German tactical map disintegrated. Reports flooded into General Bayerlein's headquarters. "Enemy tanks appearing in Sector 4. Enemy tanks in Sector 5. They are coming through the hedges." Bayerlein slammed his fist on the table. "That is impossible. They cannot climb the hedges fast enough." "They are not climbing, Herr General. They are driving through them." The confusion was total. A static defense relies on predicting the enemy's path. When the enemy can walk through walls, there are no paths. There is only the open field. The Panzer Lehr Division, the elite of the German army, was being flanked in a dozen places simultaneously. Their 88mm guns were pointed at the roads. The Shermans were behind them. By 13 hours, the American advance had covered more ground in 4 hours than they had in the previous 3 weeks. The Rhino tanks were operating in packs. They developed a rhythm. Breach. Fire. Advance. Breach. Fire. Advance. The infantry, walking behind the tanks, were protected from small arms fire. The casualty rates plummeted. The meat grinder had jammed. This was the vindication of Curtis Culin. In the heat of the battle, nobody stopped to check the transmission bolts. Nobody checked the stress fractures on the final drive housing. The only thing that mattered was that the tanks were moving. The stalemate was broken. But the Germans were not finished. The Panzer Panther tanks were still out there. They were regrouping, and they were angry. The boss fight was about to begin. July 26, 1944. 14:15 hours, near the village of Saint-Gilles. The initial shock of the Rhino assault has worn off. The Germans are professionals. They adapt. A Panzer V Panther tank, commanded by SS Unterscharführer Ernst Barkmann, sits motionless in a sunken lane. The Panther is 45 tons of superior engineering. Its 75mm KWK-42 gun has a muzzle velocity of 935 meters per second. It can penetrate the frontal armor of a Sherman at 2,000 yards. The Sherman cannot penetrate the Panther's front slope at point-blank range. Barkmann spots a Rhino-equipped Sherman moving through the adjacent field. Range, 800 yards. The Sherman is exposing its side profile as it maneuvers for a gap. Barkmann traverses the turret. He does not hurry. He knows the Sherman is trapped in the field. He knows the hedgerows are impassable walls. He waits for the Sherman to stop at the gate. This is the killing zone. He places the reticle on the ammo rack. But the Sherman does not stop at the gate. The driver, Corporal James E. Smith of the 2nd Armored Division, ignores the road. He turns the tank hard left, directly toward the solid hedgerow separating him from the sunken lane. The Panther gunner hesitates. He is waiting for the target to follow the logic of the terrain. Smith does not follow logic. He engages the Rhino. The Sherman hits the bank at 12 miles per hour. The Panther fires. The shell misses by 2 feet, burying itself in the earth mound that the Rhino is pushing. The Sherman bursts through the hedge. It lands in the sunken lane, 40 yards from the Panther. The engagement range has closed from 800 yards to 40 yards in 8 seconds. At this distance, the armor values change. The Panther's side armor is only 45 mm thick. It is vertical. It is vulnerable. Smith's gunner fires. The 75mm armor-piercing shell slams into the Panther's flank just above the road wheels. It punches through. The interior of the Panther becomes a blast furnace. The ammunition propellant ignites. The turret is blown off the ring. This was the tactical revolution. The Rhino allowed the inferior American tanks to dictate the range of engagement. They forced the Germans into knife fights, where speed mattered more than armor thickness. The chaos spreads. By the evening of July 26th, the German defensive line has not just bent, it has shattered. The 7th Corps is advancing 3 miles a day. This sounds slow, but in the hedgerows, 3 miles is a marathon. The roads are clogged with retreating German columns. They are trying to escape the trap, but the Shermans are moving parallel to them, cutting through the fields, popping out at intersections to destroy the lead trucks, then vanishing back into the green maze. The German command structure collapses. General Fritz Bayerlein of the Panzer Lehr is commanding from a Kubelwagen. His radio net is dead. He later wrote, "The Americans are everywhere. They are behind us, beside us, and among us. The front line no longer exists." He had lost 90% of his tanks. The division that was supposed to stop the invasion had been dismantled by scrap metal welded to final drives. Back at the maintenance depots, the ordnance officers were waiting for the failures. They had predicted a 40% breakdown rate for the Rhino tanks. They expected the transmissions to shear. They were wrong. The breakdown rate for Rhino tanks was actually lower than standard tanks. Why? Because the drivers weren't riding the clutch trying to climb the banks. They were driving through. The stress was on the hull, not the gears. The Tennessee hillbilly invention was mechanically sound. July 27th, 1944. The breakout turns into the breakthrough. The 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions are now running loose. They capture Coutances. The German 84th Corps is encircled in the Rancy pocket. It is a slaughter. The roads are lined with the burning wreckage of German transport. Horses, trucks, and half-tracks are twisted together. The Shermans drive past them without stopping. They are heading south. They are heading for Avranches. The infantry, the doughboys of the 4th and 9th Divisions, are struggling to keep up. They are walking 20 miles a day, but they are walking through fields that have already been cleared. The Rhino tanks act as icebreakers. They leave wide, flat paths through the hedges. The infantry uses these paths to move supplies, evacuate the wounded, and advance without being exposed to sniper fire on the roads. The synergy between tank and infantry, broken for 6 weeks, is restored. General George S. Patton arrives. He has been waiting in England, a general without an army. On August 1st, the 3rd Army is activated. Patton loves the Rhino. He inspects a column of the 6th Armored Division. He sees the jagged teeth. He kicks the steel. "That's it," he says. "That's how you fight. You don't let the enemy build a house. You kick the door in." He orders the remaining tanks in his sector to be modified immediately. The pace accelerates to a blitzkrieg. The U.S. Army is now moving faster than the German Army did in 1940. They take Avranches on July 31st. This is the gateway to Brittany and the open plains of France. The hedgerow country ends here. The terrain opens up. The specific utility of the Rhino begins to fade, but its job is done. It delivered the army out of the cage. But the Germans have one last card to play. Operation Lüttich, August 7th. Hitler orders a massive counterattack at Mortain. He strips the other fronts of armor. He gathers the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, and the 1st SS Panzer Division. His goal is to cut the American supply line at Avranches. He wants to drive a wedge to the sea. He believes the Americans are overextended. The German tanks attack at dawn. It is foggy. The Allied Air Force is grounded. This is a tank-on-tank battle. The German Panthers and Tigers hit the U.S. 30th Infantry Division. They push hard, but they run into the Rhinos again. The U.S. tanks, dug in behind the hedges, use the teeth to create firing steps. They cut halfway into the hedge, creating a hull-down position where only the turret is visible. The German attack stalls. They cannot flank. Every time they try to move through a field, they are ambushed from the side. The Rhinos allow the American reserve tanks to shift positions rapidly, plugging holes in the line before the Germans can exploit them. The counterattack fails. The Germans lose 120 tanks. Hitler's gamble destroys his mobile reserve. Meanwhile, Culin is famous. The Stars and Stripes newspaper runs a story on him. They call him the Sergeant York of the Armored Corps. He is uncomfortable with the fame. He tells a reporter, "I didn't invent it, I just saw it." He credits the Tennessee Private Roberts with the idea. But the Army needs a hero. They put Culin on a poster. They use the Rhino as propaganda to show American ingenuity. But the war is shifting. As the armies move east toward Paris, the ground changes. The bocage gives way to the wheat fields of the Falaise Plain. The hedgerows disappear. The rhino tusks, once essential, are now dead weight. They catch on bridges. They dig into the tarmac on paved roads. Drivers begin to complain. The extra 450 pounds on the nose makes the tank nose heavy. It wears out the front bogie wheels. The cutting torches come out again, this time to remove the teeth. In rest areas, crews cut the rhinos off. They toss them into ditches. The device that saved the invasion is discarded as soon as the terrain changes. This is the ruthlessness of military logistics. If it doesn't help you kill the enemy today, it is scrap. However, not everyone removes them. Some crews keep them as lucky charms. Some keep them for urban combat, using the tusks to ram barricades or flip civilian cars used as roadblocks. A tank named Blockbuster from the 3rd Armored keeps its tusks all the way to the German border. They use them to tear down fences and garden walls in Belgian villages. The legacy of the Rhino in August 1944 is measurable in miles. In July, the Army moved 5 miles. In August, they moved 400 miles. The Falaise Pocket is formed. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army are encircled. They are destroyed. 50,000 Germans captured. 10,000 dead. The road to Paris is open. Eisenhower writes a report to Marshall. The modification of the tanks was a decisive factor in the campaign. But for Curtis Culin, the war was not over. The Rhino saved thousands of lives, but it couldn't save its inventor from the random chance of infantry combat. November 1944. The Hedgerows Forest. This is not tank country. It is a dark, dense pine forest on the German border. The trees are too close together for tanks. The rhinos are parked in the rear. Culin is walking point. The Hedgerows is a nightmare of mines. The Germans have planted shoe mines, wooden boxes filled with TNT that can't be detected by metal detectors, and S-mines. Culin is an experienced scout now. He watches the ground. He looks for tripwires, but you can't see a mine buried under 6 inches of pine needles. 14 untoward hours. Culin steps forward. His boot depresses the 3 prongs of an S-mine igniter. There is a click. He freezes, but the S-mine has a delay fuse. 3.5 seconds. The propelling charge fires. The canister, the size of a soup can, shoots into the air. It reaches waist height. The main charge detonates. It sprays 360 steel balls in a horizontal circle. The blast destroys his right leg. It shreds his left arm. Shrapnel enters his face, blinding his left eye. He does not scream immediately. The shock is absolute. The medic reaches him in 30 seconds. Morphine. Tourniquet. The war ends for Curtis Culin on a stretcher in a freezing forest, 400 miles from the Hedgerows he conquered. He is evacuated to a field hospital, then to England, then to the United States. He spends a year in Walter Reed Hospital. He learns to walk with a prosthetic leg. He learns to see with one eye. He does not receive a patent. He does not ask for one. The Rhino was government work. It belongs to Uncle Sam. While Culin recovers, the war ends. The tanks stop rolling. The 50,000 Sherman tanks produced by American industry are parked in massive depots in Germany and France. They are surplus. The rhinos are stripped off and melted down. The steel returns to the economy. The swords are beaten into plowshares. The specific engineering solution to the bocage problem is forgotten because the problem no longer exists. But the forensic historian must ask, what if the rhino had never been invented? What if the Ordnance Department had enforced the regulations and court-martialed Captain King for unauthorized welding? The math is grim. Without the rhino, the stalemate in Normandy likely would have lasted into September. The Germans would have had time to fortify the Seine River line. The V-1 and V-2 rocket sites in France would have remained operational for months longer, raining death on London. The Soviet Union would have advanced further into Europe from the east. The geopolitical map of the 20th century was shaped by a piece of scrap metal. The mockery Culin faced is a case study in institutional inertia. The experts knew the tank's limitations based on the manual. Culin knew the tank's potential based on the reality. The expert sees what is written. The survivor sees what is needed. The Rhino was not a triumph of high technology. It was a triumph of the good enough solution applied at scale. In the post-war analysis, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department tried to downplay the Rhino. They released reports stating that tactical air power and artillery were the primary drivers of the breakout. They were embarrassed. They were embarrassed that a typewriter salesman solved a problem that baffled the best engineers in the Pentagon. They were embarrassed that the solution cost $1 in materials. But the soldiers knew. In the regimental histories of the 2nd Armored, the 3rd Armored, and the 29th Infantry, the Rhino is revered. They speak of it with affection. They talk about the sound of the root snapping. They talk about the look on the German prisoners' faces when a tank emerged from a solid wall. It was the psychological turning point of the campaign. Let's look at the numbers one last time. Cost of an M4 Sherman, $45,000 in 1944 dollars. Cost of training a crew, $20,000. Cost of the Rhino modification, 4 hours of labor and 400 pounds of scrap steel. Value, the liberation of Western Europe. The ROI, return on investment, is incalculable. Today, you can visit the Normandy hedgerows. They are still there. The farmers have repaired the gaps. The roots have regrown. But if you walk the sunken lanes near St. Lo with a metal detector, you will find things. You will find rusted 75 shell casings. You will find links of track. And occasionally, deep in the base of a hawthorn hedge, you will find a jagged piece of 6-inch channel iron, snapped off in 1944. These are the fossils of the Rhino. They are the physical evidence of the moment when American ingenuity met German fortification. They are the silent witnesses to the violence that freed France. Curtis Culin returned to civilian life. He went back to selling business equipment. He didn't talk much about the war. He was a member of the American Legion. He marched in parades on Memorial Day. He died in 1963. He is not as famous as Patton or Eisenhower, but in the lineage of military disruptors, he stands alongside the inventors of the stirrup and the longbow. His legacy is not in a museum. It is in the doctrine of the U.S. Army. The Culin hedgerow cutter taught the military a lesson that is taught at West Point today. The solution to a tactical problem is rarely found at headquarters. It is found at the front. Listen to the sergeant. Listen to the private who is tired of digging. The story of the Rhino is also a story about the nature of innovation. It wasn't a new technology. It was a recombination of existing technologies. A tank plus a beach obstacle, it is a hedge-cutter. It required a mind that could see the connection between two unrelated objects. That is the definition of genius. As we close this file, look at the M4 Sherman one last time. It was a flawed tank. It was tall, undergunned, and under-armored. It caught fire easily. It was mocked as the Ronson lighter. Light's first time. Every time. But with the Rhino, it became something else. It became the right tool for the job. It proves that a weapon is only as good as the mind that wields it. The Rhino didn't make the Sherman invincible. It made it relevant. And in war, relevance is the difference between victory and the scrap heap. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the forensic history of the Rhino tank, and you want to support more scripts about the forgotten mechanics of WWII, please subscribe. We don't just tell you what happened. We tell you how it worked.